kind of lift up some of the work that the Poor People's Campaign has been doing, talk a little bit about the history that we come out of, and then put out what we have in front of us to do. I don't need to tell you all here in the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that we are living in a very sick nation. Sick with poverty, sick with racism, sick with the poisoning of our water and of our air, sick with people dying because they don't have health care, sick from dying from curable diseases. And when we live in a country that claims that it's there, set up to promote the general welfare, but people are dying because they don't have medical care, but people are being cut off of water and having their kids taken away at the same time as the Nestle Corporation can bottle as much water as it wants. When we live in a moment in 2018 where the town where the Black Panther Party organized and formed in, hundreds of residents there are living with raw sewage in their yards, where diseases that have been eradicated for decades, people thought they would be seen no more, have come back out. There should be a national outcry. There should be just righteous indignation that people are living in the richest country in the world, in the richest moment in human history, at a time when they can 3D print a house, but there are more homeless people than ever before. This has to change. This is not okay. We have to stand there and stand up and put ourselves out there as people who say, this doesn't have to be that way. So Willie Baptist was quoting a favorite quote from Dr. King that I think actually is really worth us looking at in a little bit more depth. He talks about, here, I'm going to find it real quick. I can quote it usually, but I want to get it right. So he says that the poor and dispossessed in our society, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution, not against the people, but against the structures which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. There are millions of poor people in this nation who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. I think that this quote actually has a lot of wisdom in it for us. I mean, we are indeed living in a cruelly unjust society. More people in the United States die every year from poverty, from low wealth, from the lack of access to education, than do from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer combined. More people die from poverty. It's a cruel, it's an unjust society that we're living in. And that we need to organize against the structures which are at hand. We have the means, they are at hand, right? So, right now, in the United States, if you're working full-time and making minimum wage, there is not one town, there is not one county, there is not one city that you could find a 2-bedroom apartment to afford. What kind of inequality is this? Again, we have the ability to build housing. In cities like Philadelphia, there's more abandoned housing units than there are homeless people. We have the means at hand, but right now, there are more homeless kids than there's ever been before, more than during the Great Depression. And so then it leads us to this idea that we have to organize and take action together. And let's look at history. When has that happened before? Why is that the theory of change that Poor People First has? Why is that the theory of change that the Poor People's Campaign, A National Call for Moral Revival has? Because not just in our lifetimes, but when we look back at how things change, when we look and we study the lives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Moses Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe and William Lloyd Garrison, folks who were most impacted, linking arms with moral leaders, linking arms with all people of goodwill and conscience, have come together, banded together, and been able to change and overthrow slavery. Or if we study someone like Ida B. Wells, the stories go that she would show up at some of those lynching mobs with 6, 7, 8 other people. And there'd be mobs of hundreds. And she would disband those mobs. And she'd put an end to lynching. Or we have stories of Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who said, women deserve the right to vote, and who organized. And it wasn't men leading that movement. They were involved. But as Willie often says, if we had left it to just the men, we might not have women's suffrage. And we have the stories of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, sharecroppers in the rural South, or coal miners from West Virginia, or steel workers from Pennsylvania, who fought and won not just better wages, not just better working conditions, but dignity, but changing how things were. And I, and many of us, come out of a movement of homeless people, where we organized in 25 cities across the country. At our height, we had upwards of 25 or 30,000 homeless people organizing. We won the right for homeless people to vote, even if you don't have an address. We were able to set up all kinds of programs led by homeless people. And we had this slogan, we might be homeless, but we're not helpless. And that we can speak for ourselves and organize not just ourselves, but the whole society. So if we look back at these moments in history, we can see our path to freedom. It's when we come together, united, across all the lines of difference. when we come together, when we don't let ourselves be pitted against each other, when we don't let it be that we can just focus on this one issue over here, but forget these other ones over there. So when we fight it back against the lie that there isn't enough, or that we're to blame for the problems that we're having, when we do that type of organizing, we're able to win. And so the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, launched only about a year ago. And we heard this morning about the amazing work that folks here in Pennsylvania and in Vermont and New Jersey and other places have done. And that rests on a long history of people organizing and standing up and saying, we want to be free. We need a Poor People's Campaign. So many of us, including Put People First Pennsylvania, we're organizing the Poor People's Campaign for many, many years. We're talking about what does it take to unite and organize the poor as a social force, as a powerful group who, again, can change all of society. And that cry came from folks in Lowndes County, Alabama, who have raw sewage in their yards and said, this doesn't have to be. And that came from folks in Detroit, Michigan, whose water had been cut off. And that came from homeless people in Aberdeen, Washington. And it came from folks here in Pennsylvania who have said, everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to health care and a healthy life. And so I want us to actually celebrate where we are right now. Because as people have said, if we just read the news, if we just follow what's going on, it doesn't always feel like there's a lot to celebrate. Injustice seems like it's reigning the day. Every week there's another attack on the programs that we need to survive. Every couple of weeks there's another storm that we know devastates the lives and livelihoods of the poor and the vulnerable the most. We keep on having people who have no regard for humanity, no regard for the dignity of other human beings, be placed in positions of power. And it sends a message that life doesn't matter, especially poor life, especially the lives of people of color, especially the lives of young people and older people, especially the lives of women, especially the lives of queer folk. But we know something different is possible. We know that it doesn't have to be this way. And what we pulled off in the 40 days of moral, nonviolent, direct action is historic. So over the course of those 40 days, there were people organizing actions in 42 states across this country and in Washington, D.C. Over the course of those 40 days, almost 6,000 people engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience. Over those 40 days, 50,000 people were actively involved in those actions and in that organizing. In those 40 days and leading up to them, grassroots leaders in those 42 states across the country organized 350 trainings to train people in nonviolent civil disobedience. Historians tell us that what we pulled off in May and June of this year was the most expansive, was the largest wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century. But they say that because of the work that happened in the states all at the same time, over a long period of time, it's probably the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in our country's history. And who did that, y'all? Who did that? Was it some big organization that had lots of money? No. Was it these preachers who come in and saying that there'll be pie in the sky when you die? No. Was it the nonprofits that make a lot of money off of a bunch of our lives and misery? No. It was us. It was the people. It was poor people. It was people who don't have enough money to necessarily pay all of our bills in a month. But we got ourselves to state capitals, and we made our voices heard. It's the power of the poor in history, y'all. We, poor people, who had an idea that we could do, but didn't have the resources to do it, didn't have the infrastructure to do it, we were able to be featured in every national news network in this country. We staged a narrative takeover. They don't want to talk about poverty? You got to talk about poverty. You want to define who's poor as a couple of people over here? We want to show you that there's 140 million people who are either experiencing poverty or are so close to poverty that one hurricane, one emergency, one healthcare crisis, one layoff will mean absolute misery. I don't know that much about social media. I try to tweet a little bit. I post some photos on social media. But we were able, in the course of the 40 days of action, to get tens of millions, not a couple hundred, not a couple thousand, tens of millions of social media impressions, that everybody's got the right to live. They're saying somebody's hurting our people and it's gone on far too long. And then we still got it. Because last week, we had a hearing in Congress, and then we had a hearing in Virginia, and we trended nationally again. Because people are out there in the thousands, in the millions, looking for a campaign like ours. And when I say like ours, it's because this Poor People's Campaign, it's Put People First Poor People's Campaign. It's the Vermont Workers Center's Poor People's Campaign. It's the people's, it's poor people's campaign. Because we're the ones that are building it, and we're the ones who, in the words of some of the Fight for 15 workers that I was doing civil disobedience with this week, our backs are against the wall, and all we can do is push. Right?
Right.
What else are we going to do? In 1968, when Dr. King called for the Poor People's Campaign, it was not a popular position. Folks said, why are you trying to organize the poor, especially across geography, especially across race? And most organizations and most faith groups wanted very little to do with it. In fact, none of the different faith organizations and denominations came out in support. Some did after he was killed as a memorial to him. But those faith bodies were not on the front lines. One of the things that I think is deeply significant about the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is that we have 12 major faith bodies amongst Muslims, amongst Hindus, amongst Jews, amongst different denominations of Christians, evangelical, Pentecostal, Catholic, mainline Protestant, who have said, not just that I'll pray for you, not just that we'll pat you in the back and say you're doing some good work, we're going to go back and worship God, but those folks have come forward and said, we'll go to jail with you. We'll bring our congregations out into the fight with you. More than 10 international unions have done the same, following the lead of the people. And if you were there on June 23rd or you watched that call to action rally, you saw international presidents of unions not stand up and give some great talk, not just be fight, fight, fight. They introduced the low-wage workers in their unions and said, for a long time, labor has said that poverty is not our issue. But if we look at workers today, there are 62 million people who are making less than a living wage. We had hundreds of national organizations endorse the campaign. But their endorsement was because people in the states at the grassroots had been organizing. When we started the campaign, folks said, well, you know, you need to have some of those known national organizations on board, and that's how we'll know that you're doing something good. We said, no, that's not this model. That's not how movements are built. We just had a meeting in Binghamton, New York, and there were folks from Put People First there. There were folks from the Southern Tier Food Bank. There were folks from the Vermont Workers Center. There were folks from grassroots organizations who are of the community, of the people. And when those folks start to organize, those national organizations will have to follow. And that's what happened. There's a lot to be learned from what we pulled off. But it's just the beginning. For folks that tuned in on June 23rd, where there were 25,000 people on the National Mall, right where Resurrection City had been in '68, and within spitting distance of the Capitol. What we announced there was that those folks there or tuning in, because there were 400,000 people who were watching the whole proceedings, were the founding members of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And what we were committing ourselves to that day, what we had shown throughout the 6 weeks of Moral Fusion Direct Action, was that we were here to organize, organize, organize. And that this Poor People's Campaign would only be a success if we launched a massive organizing drive. in small towns, in rural areas, in big cities, in small cities, amongst indigenous folks, amongst immigrants, amongst African Americans, amongst poor white people, amongst synagogues and mosques, a massive organizing drive. Because what we said and continue to believe is that this stage of the work is about three things. We need to shift the narrative. That's just not about talking. That's just not telling a different story. That's that, as we put out, in 2016, there were 26 presidential debates. And not one of them had to take up health care. Not one of them had to take up poverty. Not one of them had to take up voting rights. Not one of them talked about the polluting of water. That we can look at the headlines, we can follow the tweets, and the issues that we all know are our life and death issues barely make it into the public conversation. And when they do, not with solutions from us, the people. Not with demands from us, the people. So we have to shift this narrative. We have to call out the conditions, the reality, and the demands coming from our communities. We said we have to impact policy. We have to impact elections. Now, that's not about getting one person elected versus someone else. Because right now, we all know that those that are running for office don't really represent our issues, don't really care about our lives. But if we're going to be able to get universal single-payer health care, if we're going to be able to organize for living wages, we have to make the issues that matter to us be what's out in the public square with our solutions. Highlighting things like the water affordability program that folks in Michigan have come up with. Highlighting this Medicaid army that you all are building. Highlighting this revocation of the doctrine of discovery that Indigenous brothers and sisters are saying. We have to have our issues out there and to be able to impact the policies that affect our lives. But that what we mostly have to do is build power. And what that looks like is uniting and organizing. That looks like going door to door. That looks like having barbecues and holiday parties and parades and exactly the kind of work that you all are doing here in Pennsylvania and teaching it to the rest of the country. How do we organize? How do we build power? And so what I want to put out to you all today is some of those next steps. And it starts with organizing, organizing, organizing. Organizing those that have come forward already and organizing people that are not yet organized. And uniting people, not just in word, not just to link arms and sing kumbaya, but uniting people, having people see that denying people health care in Johnstown, Pennsylvania means that people in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania are also going to be denied health care. Showing that this lie of pitting people against each other can no longer continue. So right now we're in this stage of organizing, of canvassing, of going door to door, of building up our power. And that's about a number of things. We're also trying to organize a series of hearings. We've learned from folks in New York State and folks here in Pennsylvania that holding community hearings, holding truth commissions, our powerful way to lift up not just the stories of what we're facing, but also the demands. Also what it is that we want and need, and how that comes out of the work and the experience that each of us is having. And in addition to doing this grassroots deep organizing and holding these hearings, folks are starting to organize assemblies like this. Folks are starting to do bus tours and caravans across their states. And you all here in Pennsylvania, you have Put People First PA. You're organized in many counties across the state. You have something that you can bring people into. Because what we're trying to do is register people for a movement. Register people for the Poor People's Campaign and for Put People First. To bring people in, to build organizations that can actually build power and take power in this country. And so what we want to put out to y'all is what some of the next steps could look like. Would you all join us for a Poor People's Summit this next spring, where we can put out our demands, where we can say, we're getting organized, we're building a nonviolent army of the poor. And then will you help to organize towards a massive march the next summer? So in June, April, July of 2020. And to get us there, what if we organize freedom schools? What if we look back and think about the role that the citizenship schools played during the civil rights movement and other political education processes where we bring new people into this work and we develop our commitment for the long haul? We showed that we can capture the attention of this country. We showed that we can pull off something really big. A lot of folks said to us when they read the demands of the campaign, "You're asking for too much. Don't you think you should just focus on one issue? Don't you think you could just have these things incrementally over some time?" And we said, well, it's good that you weren't the negotiator. At my workplace. It's good that you weren't the person set up to try to end Jim Crow. It's good that you weren't putting out the program against abolition, against slavery. Because we might have ended up with just a weekend off. Or just 80 hours a week of work. We see the connection between these issues. We have mapped out that any place that is using racism to divide us, any place that is using voter suppression to bring people into office that then hurt everybody, that those same places have the highest poverty. That those same places have the least protections for environment. That those same places discriminate against immigrants. That those same places discriminate against LGBTQI folks. That those same places, those same people, that same structure doesn't give a damn about any of our lives. And so if the people that we're up against are mean and cynical enough to oppress us all, are we hopeful? Are we smart enough? Are we caring enough to come together and unite across those differences. What we have seen being in a gathering like this is that we are, because we're doing it. It might be not reported. It might not be what's put out in Donald Trump's tweets. It might not even be what the mainstream media has any interest in talking about. But there is a movement growing. And it's a movement that's involving hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. And it's a movement on the right side of history. This idea of y'all being in the Capitol and singing out, which side are you on? This is a moment for choosing sides. Are we on the side of injustice? Are we on the side of lies and untruths? Are we on the side of pitting people against each other? Or are we on the side of doing the right thing, of making everybody's lives better, and of abolishing racism, abolishing poverty, ending ecological devastation, and stopping this war economy, this militarism that degrades life? And are we going to fight against this distorted narrative, this evil narrative that blames us, the poor, not just for our problems, but for the whole world's problems? Against this narrative that says that we cannot get along, that our differences are too big. And against this narrative that there isn't enough, that we just have to rob Peter to pay Paul, that we just have to give up a little bit because everyone can't have. That is not the way of justice. That's not the side that I think we're all on. And this work, as we know, is not easy. But it's right. Forward together.
Not one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Put people first.
Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first. Put people first.
Can we have a huge, huge round of applause for Reverend Dr. Theoharris?